Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. We're very happy to host this We Are seminar in macroeconomics and finance today. I am Stefania Albanesi, and I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh and part of the CEPR, and I'll be hosting today. And today we're going to have a paper by Alessia Russo, who is at the University of Padua, joined with Francesco Lanza and Tim Worrell, on intergenerational insurance. And so we're going to go for an hour. And Alessia has said that she would welcome questions at any point of the presentation. So feel free, if you have a question, to unmute yourself and just ask the question. There's also the chat available, but whenever possible, we'd love to have voice questions just to make the interaction a little bit more lively, and so that we can all benefit from those questions as well. I think we can just get started. So Alessia, why don't you start? And thank you so much.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and thanks for this invitation. It's very nice to be here, this virtual event. So I'm presenting today this paper joined with Francesco Lanza and Tim Worrell, who are also in the audience now. Okay, let's start with some motivation for this paper. So this is a picture of a recent event in France. It is March 2023, which are the mass protests in France against the pension reform. So we know that in France, pensions retirement is at age 62, and they want to increase at age 64. So it's not a big change, but in any case, there have been a lot of protests against this reform. Now, this kind of fiscal policy is a policy in which, if the current generation are not sustaining fiscal burden, then probably future generations are going to pay it. So there's going to be a pass-through onto future generations that, and some future generations at some point has to pay the bill for funding pension today. Also, the Pope, after in these discussions, intervened and said that the pension system should not be overwhelmed on future generations, the cost of the current pension. Okay, so this is just as a motivation, but this paper is a theoretical paper. And we started from the observation that many fiscal reforms in reality are very difficult to implement. And one of the constraints in implementation are these political constraints that we can model as limited enforcement. So the government has a limited enforcement in implement fiscal policies. And in particular, if fiscal policies involve different generations, then there's going to be an intergenerational conflict, which, as in the case, for example, of pension reforms, may imply that the higher fiscal burden is postponed on future generations. But then in this case, there's going to be welfare losses because of a partial intergenerational insurance. So we are not going to have the perfect intergenerational insurance because part of the cost is going to be postponed to the future. So then the questions of this paper are basically two. So we want to study what is the optimal intergenerational insurance when there are limited enforcement friction. So I want to characterize this optimal insurance under this friction. And then we want to understand how much risk is spread across different generations. Okay, so what is the contribution of this paper? We characterize theoretically the optimal intergenerational insurance under limited enforcement frictions when agent belongs to different generations and are finitely linked, so in an overlapping generation economy. While the past literature has done three different things, and we are at the intersection of these three literature. So one literature has actually studied optimal intergenerational risk sharing, but under full enforcement, so without the limited enforcement friction. I just cited the few initial seminal papers, but of course, there have been many papers after that. The first paper was Ayagari-Peled in 1991, and after that, many other papers study conditions for optimality under full enforcement. A second literature actually is looking at intergenerational risk sharing, but under a positive approach, not under normative approach, in which intergenerational insurance is arising as a voting equilibrium outcome. And in this case, intergenerational insurance is not necessarily optimal. While in our case, we want to study optimality, so we want to have a normative perspective. And third, There is another literature to which also Tim, my co-author, contributed. This was a seminal paper by him in 1988 with Thomas and Warren, in which they study optimal risk sharing under limited enforcement friction, as we do, but under the assumption that the agents are infinitely linked. So basically, we start methodologically from this literature and we replace the assumption of infinitely lived agents with overlapping generations. Okay, so what we find? So we characterize basically a new mechanism in which we highlight a trade-off, the classical trade-off actually between incentives and efficiency. So as said, the framework is going to be normative. That is, the intergenerational insurance is going to be chosen by planner. So I'm going to introduce this planner problem, and the planner will like to provide incentives to the generations or the highest incentive to walk away, to walk out from the intergenerational insurance scheme. So in order to provide incentives, the planner is willing to actually partially spread the risk burden to future generations rather than to the current generations, in order to make the current generation willing to accept the intergenerational insurance. So this incentive side create a connection, a correlation of consumption between adjacent generations, because part of the risk today is actually postponed to future generations. So in order to provide incentive, the optimal mechanism is generating an autocorrelation of consumption between adjacent generations. Of course, when the planner is postponing risk to future generations, then the risk sharing possibilities decline. So there is less possibility in the future to share the risk. So there is a loss of efficiency due to imperfect risk sharing. And then in order to reestablish efficiency, to increase welfare and to avoid this propagation of shocks, perpetual propagation of shocks, we show that that is optimal to periodically reset the provision of incentives. That is, periodically, these shocks must not be transmitted onto the future. So this is the efficiency side of the mechanism. So consumption has to be periodically reset to levels which we define welfare maximizing levels. So we see already from here that we are going to generate consumption cycles, which are not due to, because the environment is going to be very simple, are not due to technological reasons, but is just due to these limited enforcement frictions. So what we characterize in the paper is these dynamics of consumption generated by the limited enforcement frictions, both in transitions and in the long run. So we show that there exists a long run distribution, which is stationary, and also in the long run, there will be these cycles of consumption. So what I want to show you today are how these cycles of consumptions look like and why they are generated by these limited enforcement frictions. Okay, so this is the theoretical part of the paper, and then we ask, okay, but what are policy institutions that may replicate, may support the optimal allocation? There are many, of course, and we consider an example, a combination of taxes, transfers, and state contingent bonds that can replicate the optimal allocation. So in this way, we actually touch another literature, which is the literature on debt sustainability. So we can actually address some issues that has also been puzzling in the current literature so far. And I want to highlight mainly two in this presentation. So first of all, we show that the tax rate, so in this system, with these instruments, there will be a tax rate, which is a function of the current debt. So the larger is the debt we show, and the larger has to be the taxes that has to be paid in order to repay the debt, in order to make it sustainable.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? So what are the assumptions you make on the size of a population? Is it kept kind of constant, and the assumption on the path of a real rate also, or is it an endogenous variable? Or?
Yeah, okay. So just to make the things very simple, also for this presentation, population is going to be constant. So it's going to be just fixed population, and the rate is going to be endogenous. Yeah. So we show that this feature of fiscal fatigue and the fiscal reaction function, which means that when the debt is high, tax rate can't increase so much, can't increase a lot. And the reason is very intuitive, is because exactly the limited enforcement friction. I can't raise tax so much, otherwise people are not willing to pay taxes. This is what is called fiscal fatigue in the literature. And also we highlight this hedging role of public debt. So public debt in our model is going to be a good hedge and is going to have a negative beta, such that actually we can sustain a high level of debt, even if in expectation we have a very low primary surplus or even just deficit. In expectation, we can sustain positive debt. And then in this way, we are touching this literature, current literature that talk about debt valuation puzzle, why we can observe a so high level of debt, and if this is sustainable. We show that under some condition, it can be sustainable. Okay, so the roadmap for this presentation will be the following. I want to introduce the model, then very briefly talk about the benchmark, which is full enforcement, so just remove the friction, and then consider the limited enforcement case, and then talk about this application of debt sustainability. Okay, model is very simple. It is just one slide because it's a discrete time model. There are two periods living generation each point in time. You can think as a unitary mass of young and unitary mass of old. So each generation is living two periods, and it is a pure endowment economy. So there is a total endowment, which is E, which is split between the current young and current old, and is a perishable consumption good, so it can be saved. There are two sources of risk. One source is aggregate risk or growth, so there is a stochastic growth, which are denoted by gamma. So the growth of the economy could be high or low. And then there is another source of risk, which is idiosyncratic, which is basically a sort of distributional risk, which are denoted by S. So what is S? S is the share of endowment of the young over total endowment. And suppose just for this presentation that there are just two idiosyncratic states, and they're denoted with the S1 and S2. So S1 is the state in which the young is relatively poorer, and S2 is the state in which the young is relatively richer. Just remember also this color, because I will use the red for when the young is poor and blue when the young is rich, okay? And then there is a probability distribution of these two shocks. Okay, so I will denote by capital C, which is theoretically, possibly, is a function of all histories of shocks, rho over the power t, the consumption of the young. Being a pure endowment economy, the consumption of the old is the total endowment minus the consumption of the young. And then I will also use a logarithmic utility to make presentation even simpler. And given the homogeneous properties of the utility, we show that actually we can consider the trended economy and characterize, rather than the level of consumption, we can characterize this small c, which is the level of consumption of the young over the total endowment. So it's the share of consumption of the young over total endowment. So we'll characterize small c, and then we can actually recover the consumption levels of the stochastically growing economy. Okay, what is the planner problem? It's a very standard, simple. So I want to characterize this infinite sequence of C, small c, the consumption of the young, as a share of total endowment. And in order to do this, I solve a planner problem where the planner is taking care of the utility of all generation. So the planner value is given by the utility of the current old. So there is an initial old with just living one period. And given that it is a log utility, there is a log, and then is 1 because it's a share of total endowment. So it's 1 minus the consumption of the young. So this is a consumption of the old. And I weight the current, the utility of the current old by these parameters. Remember that beta, maybe I didn't introduce beta, but beta is the individual discount factor, while delta is the discount factor of the planner. So how much the planner is discounting the utility of generations. This beta and delta could be different, could be equal. For this presentation, actually, I will assume that they are equal, so I don't have to keep track of beta delta. Okay, so the planner is taking care of the current old, and also is taking care of all utility of all future generations. So this is the other term of the value function is going to be the utility of the current young and also the utility of all future generations, weighted by the discount factor delta. So here I reported what is U. So capital U is the intertemporal utility of any generation born in the state rho t, which is a sum of the log utility when young plus the expected utility when old. Okay, so this is just the utilitaristic approach of the planner, who is maximizing the sum of utilities, expected utilities of all generations, starting condition on the current state, which is rho t. This is a problem of the planner without frictions. So if the planner should solve the problem without any friction, should just maximize this objective function. But there are frictions, and the frictions are the limited enforcement constraints, what I call limited enforcement constraints, which actually can be modeled as participation constraints. So there are old and young, so we will have participation constraints of the old and participation constraints of the young. So for the old decide to participate. In this case, if they don't participate, as in this literature, the outside option is the autarky. I will just consume my endowment. Okay. So for the old, if I don't participate, I will just consume my endowment. It means that the consumption of the young can be smaller, has to be smaller or equal than the endowment of the young. Or said another way, the consumption of the old, so the old will never have a consumption which is lower than their own endowment. So if any, they will receive some endowment from the young, but they will never pay the consumption from to the young. Otherwise, they will just opt out, and they can consume their own endowment. Okay, so this is the first constraint, which is a very sort of boundary condition on consumption. Well, the participation constraint of the young says that the intertemporal utility of the young in consuming the consumption that the planner is delivering to the young has to be larger or equal than the intertemporal utility of consuming just the endowment. Okay, which is the autarky level. Okay, so these are the sets of constraints, and we have many of these constraints because we have for each state in each time and for all generations. Okay, this is clear, the planner problem. Okay, just a couple of definitions. So then I will define sustainable an allocation. So a sequence of small c of consumption share if this consumption shares satisfy all the set of constraints that I showed before, the participation constraint of young and old. And then is optimal if this sustainable intergenerational rule maximizes the value function of the planner, subject also to another constraint, which is the initial promise utility to the first old. So what we want to draw is a Pareto frontier, is an intergenerational Pareto frontier. So then I can use the initial old, and I can promise the initial old a level of utility, which I denote omega naught, and I can change this omega naught. Okay, changing omega naught, I can actually draw an intergenerational Pareto frontier because I will change the promise utility to the current old, and then check what is going to be the value, the intertemporal value of the planner to all future generations. So this promise keeping constraint said that to the current old, the consumption that I deliver has to be, in terms of utility, at least larger than what I've promised, omega naught. With this omega naught, I can change.
So Alessia, I just want to draw a contrast between this problem and the standard infinitely lived model participation constraint. Probably I think what most people are familiar with, right? So in the context, the planner always has the opportunity to use continuation utilities to provide incentives, as well as, the distribution of current consumption. Instead, here you have this asymmetry between the old and the young, by which for the old, it's as if they were in a static, interaction with the planner. So you have this hard constraint that you can never give them less than their endowment. And therefore, this to some degree constrains the degree to which the planner is then able to provide incentives to the young who do have a dynamic problem. So there's this conventional trade-off between, future promises versus current consumption, but then how much, the planner can do that is really constrained by the olds, which to me sort of sets up this result that you mentioned at the beginning, that you're going to get these consumption cycles, as if, time stops and you start again. Is that connected to sort of the fact that the old have the sort of, nearly static, if you want, once they're old, kind of incentive interaction with the planner?
Okay, so it's true. So the participation of the old, so the problem of the old is quite static, and then it's not having so much in the characterization of the problem, because it's just constraining how much consumption can I promise to the current young or the old, vice versa, because it's constrained by the endowment. So it's not this what is going to create actually the cycles. I'm going to show exactly the point in which there's going to be this connection between participation and constraint. But the idea is that while in the infinite living case, I have, for example, two agents, and I have the participation constraint with all the continuation utility, the infinite continuation utility. Also in the promise keeping constraint, I have not yet showed now the recursive formulation of the problem. I'm going to have a promise keeping constraint. So there you see the difference, because in the promise keeping constraint, there will not be the continuation utility of an agent, because the promise is just the current old. So the old is entering, but is entering not because of the constraint one, is entering because of promise keeping constraint, which is not yet in the slides. But now we're showing the recursive formulation, and then probably is going to be clear. Okay, which is related to this constraint actually, but in the recursive formulation. Okay, before going to the recursive formulation of the problem, I want to introduce two assumptions, which makes actually the analysis even simpler. So the first assumption is that, remember, there are these two shocks, the idiosyncratic and the aggregate shock, and I want to assume that these are IID, so are also independent of each other. So in this case, we know that in a representative agent model, for example, and also we can show that any sustainable intergenerational insurance rule will depend only on the idiosyncratic shock. So the aggregate shock will not affect the consumption share as a share of total endowment. It will enter, of course, again, when we consider the consumption in the stochastically growing economy, but not in the detrending economy. And the second assumption is basically, if you look at this, given the log utility, this is the intertemporal unit condition. It's saying that in the outer key, the agent will like to save if they could, but they can't because there is not storage possibility. But if they could, they would like to save. So under this assumption, then this allows an existing conditions. Basically, there will be a non-trivial sustainable intergenerational insurance rule. Non-trivial in the sense that there will be an intergenerational insurance rule which is different from the outer key, which could be also an optimal intergenerational insurance rule, just being an outer key. Okay, with this assumption, I can then reformulate the problem in a recursive way. And now we introduce the classical promise utility approach. So I will denote with omega R the state contingent promise to the current young when the next period state is R. So today there is a young who is born in some state, is young and poor, and then I want to promise him a promise which is contingent on the state of tomorrow, when old is going to be young or poor. And this is what I define omega R. The current promise, which is a state variable, is instead omega. What is omega? Omega is what I promised to the previous period young, who today is old. So to the previous period young, I have promised something, and today is old, I have to deliver this promise. I have to maintain the promise, which is omega. So now I can reformulate my planar problem in the recursive way using omega as the relevant state variable. So the value of the planar will depend on the idiosyncratic risk and omega. So this is going to be my state space. And the value function is the same as before. So it's going to be a current period payoff, which is the utility of the old and today and the utility of the young today, and the continuation utility, which will depend on the state of tomorrow. And now the constraints will be, okay, this first constraint is just a feasibility condition, so it's a boundary conditions. So the promise utility, the state contingent promise can be neither too large nor too low. There will be boundary constraints, and these are endogenous. Okay, I will not focus on this for this presentation, but we have to characterize endogenously. And the participation constraint of the old just means, as we said before, that consumption can be larger than the consumption of the young can be larger than is endowment share. And now I reformulated the participation constraint of the young just using as a promise utility my notation, so omega r. And I also added the promise keeping constraint. So remember, omega is what I have promised to the previous period young in terms of utility, and today this previous period young is becoming old. So to the current old, I have to keep the promise that the utility can be smaller than what I have promised yesterday. And today is the promise that I have to keep. Okay, so for this presentation, then just make this simplification. So let's assume the beta is equal delta. Let's not consider a boundary condition. And let's also not consider the participation constraint of the old, just to put in emphasis that the dynamics is not driven by the participation constraint of the old, but is driven by the other two constraints. And then I will define with mu the multiplier associated with the participation constraint of the young, and the lambda the multiplier associated with the promise keeping constraint. Just keep in mind these two multipliers. And what I want to characterize are these functions, these policies, which are consumption and state contingent promises, where X is my state space. Okay. Now let's consider with the benchmark. Let's suppose the simple, that is, actually there is full enforcement. So my planner has just to maximize its value function, and the problem is going to be subject to the promise keeping constraint, but not to the participation constraint beyond. So there are not limited enforcement friction. The only thing that I have to do, I have to keep the past promises. Whatever I have promised in the past, I have to keep this promise. So when the planner is solving the problem, and then it will have this, so we refine first the condition, of course, and there are two sets of the conditions. So the first is just saying that the ratio of consumption, remember, is log, so I just remove the marginal utility. So the ratio of consumption between the current old, which is the denominator, and the current young has to be equal to, I simplified, so here it should be beta over delta, beta and delta is equal 1, so it should be equal 1 plus the multiplier associated with the promise keeping constraint. Now suppose, for example, that the promise keeping constraint is lag. So the past promise, I can keep the past promises, and this constraint is really not binding. Full enforcement means that C is just equal 1/2. Okay, in the full enforcement case, what is optimal is the full equalization of consumption in all states of the world and between young and old. This is the benchmark. But if the promise keeping is binding, and this could be binding because from the past I inherited some promises and I have to keep this promise. Now to deliver this promise, I have to make the young pay more taxes. Suppose we just enter into the application, but in terms of application would be that they have to pay more taxes in order to keep the promise of consumption of the current old. And then this implies that the consumption of the young can be 1/2, but has to be smaller than 1/2. While consumption of the old has to be larger. Okay, this is what in the full enforcement case, the policy of consumption. What about the policy of promise utility? What I have to promise to the current young when they become old? So this first of the condition just is telling me that whatever I have to promise is a level of utility which maximizes my intergenerational Pareto frontier. It's the one that makes the derivative of the value function equal 0. And how is looking like this Pareto frontier is looking like this. So I can draw, I have omega, which is a state variable. I have a value function, which is actually equal to, I can find a threshold level of omega, let's say omega star. If the past promise are sufficiently small, then the promise keeping constraint is slack. I can keep the promise. And so we see this envelope condition, this is going to be equal 0 if omega is sufficiently small. So the value function is just flat up to this some point, because past promises has been small, so the promise keeping is not binding. When the promise keeping is not binding, of course, this is becoming negative. So it means that this Pareto frontier is declining. So this is how the Pareto frontier is looking like. So what the full enforcement is saying is that we want actually to promise always this level of utility. What I want to promise to the current Young is just omega star. Whatever is the state, whatever, independently whether they are rich or poor. Okay? So is this is a recap of what I just said. So there exists an omega threshold I call omega star, which in this case is a log 1 alpha, which is the superior of the Pareto frontier. And then if omega, I start from initial promise, which is smaller than omega star, then I can just deliver the consumption, full equalization of consumption 1 alpha. Otherwise, if for some reason I'm inherited from the past this I promise, then I have to deliver a consumption to the Young, which is smaller than 1 alpha, and which is also declining when omega is larger. If I have to repay to satisfy a higher level of past promises. So in sum, in the full enforcement case, I have I can do these two plots for policies. On the left side, I have the promise utility panel. So what I promise, the state contingent promise, is just a flat line, which is equal to omega star. And then whatever is my initial omega naught, suppose I start from here, I will jump immediately to this point, because the planner wants to maximize the value function. And in terms of consumption, then it means that if I start from this point, because omega naught was here, I will jump immediately to full equalization of consumption. So in fact, there is no dynamics, just one period dynamics, but there are not going to be any cycles because it's going to be equalization of consumption. Okay, so in this framework, I want to add now the limited enforcement friction and see where the cycles come from. So when we add the promise keeping, the participation constraint of the Young, we add the multiplier associated with the participation constraint of the Young. So now these are the same first of the condition before. I just add the participation constraint, so I will have this multiplier mu, which is appearing in the first of the condition. In particular, let's look first at this ratio of consumption between the current Young and current old. And suppose that we are in a state in which the participation constraint of the Young is binding. Why is binding? Generally, it's binding when it's rich. Why? Because the outset option is high, and also the planner actually is asking it to pay high taxes because the marginal cost is low. So these guys are the ones that are protesting. They don't want to pay taxes. And then in order to provide them incentive, I have to actually deliver them a consumption which is larger than what I would have done in the full enforcement case. And we see from this first of the condition. This is in terms of consumption. What in terms of promise utility? What I have to promise to this current Young? Well, now this is mu is larger than 0. So the participation constraint is binding. So I can't promise the maximum of the Pareto frontier. I have to promise more. So I can draw a similar Pareto frontier of what I've done before, in which there is also in this case a critical level, which is not omega star, is a different critical level. I will call omega naught S, because it's also contingent on the state in which the Young is born. And then this Pareto frontier is flat up to this point and then is declining as before. Compared to the first best would have been a bit upper. So there is a welfare loss compared to the full enforcement case. Remember that before the planner wanted to be always at the top in this point of the Pareto frontier. Now, it is not necessarily true because it could be that it is actually efficient to go down along the Pareto frontier if this multiplier, larger is the multiplier. So tighter is the participation constraint of the young and more incentive as the planner to promise even more utility tomorrow in order to slacken the participation constraint. So then it could be that it is going down. Of course, ideally, it would like to come back to this point, but it is not necessarily true that it can do immediately or it want to do. It could decide actually to promise even more. And we see from this updated rule the connection within the participation constraint. Now we have many participation constraints, one for each generation. So these are all concatenated each other. Because I can take the envelope condition, put it forward one period, and I can connect this first order condition with the envelope condition. So what I found is that the tightness of the multiplier, the participation constraint today, is equal to the tightness of the multiplier associated with the promise keeping constraint tomorrow. But remember that the participation constraint today is of the young, and the promise keeping of tomorrow is of the old tomorrow, which is the young today. Okay, so that there will be a connection. So this lambda basically is the mu of the previous period. Okay. And this is what is connecting the consumption between generations. And is generating this cycle that now we show graphically how they look like. So again, just to recap, omega naught is this point, the maximum of the Pareto frontier, which is again the point in which you want to come back, but you can't come back immediately. And okay, so just in a nutshell, just to recap, the main message that I want to deliver is this. So the planner will like to promise this welfare maximizing level of promise that I call omega naught S, the maximum of the Pareto frontier. To the current young, but if the participation constraint of the young is binding, the current young is refusing to accept it. And then the planner must promise more in order to relax the participation constraint of the current young. But then a higher promise utility means that more consumption must be delivered to the next period older, which means that possibly the next period, the participation constraint of the young is becoming even tighter. Okay. So what we characterize is the dynamics of promise utility. So what are the properties of this promise utility? The promise utility is varying along 3 dimensions, is varying over the current omega, the current idiosyncratic shock, and the next period idiosyncratic shock. And these comparative statics are very intuitive. So if the current omega increase, so if I have inherited high promises from the past, I have to promise even more. There is a sort of rollover, or it sounds a constant scheme, it's not. We're going to show it's not a bubble, so because it's sustainable. Okay, so higher promise in the past means more promise in the future. Is also increasing the current S, which is if the young is richer, I have to promise more, while is decreasing in R, which is the next period idiosyncratic risk, which is if the next period old is richer, so R is lower, then I promise more. So these are 3 comparisons which are quite intuitive. And then importantly, there is a critical level of promise utility, which actually comes from, we find sufficient condition under which we can find this omega critical. What is the omega critical? It's a level of past promise, such that if the past promises are sufficient as lower than this level, and the current young is poor, then the participation constraint of the current young is always slack. Okay, So we find conditions under which below a certain level of past promises, if the current young is poor, his participation is lack. So I can promise to this young the welfare maximizing promises. And because of this property, there is resetting. So anytime that this generation is born under this condition, I can reset past promises and I can just forget the history of past shocks and restart the cycles. And also another feature of these promises is that they have fixed points. We show an example of these families of promises, but all fixed points are equal to the full enforcement omega star. So we have this regularities condition. Okay, and to show, just to keep in mind, okay, this is an example of how this promise utility look like. Remember that before in the full enforcement case, it was very simple because the promise utility was just a flat line. It was equal to omega star. So independently of past promises, independently of the current asyncratic state or next period asyncratic state, it was just omega star. While now, it depends on omega, it depends on the current state, and depends on the next period state. So on the left panel, we have the case in which the young is poor, and here the young is rich today. And the blue line is when the young is also rich tomorrow, and the red line is when the young is poor tomorrow. Okay, so then we can recover the three comparative statics I showed you before. So all these promises are increasing in omega. For the rich, these levels of promise are larger than for the poor. But then if tomorrow the young is poor and the old is richer, then I promise more to the old which is poor, who is poor. And also this threshold level of promises in the case in which the current young is poor, there exists the threshold level. So you see from here, from this plot, that the dynamics is not so trivial because now we can start from, for example, we start from here, an omega naught, and suppose the young today is rich and tomorrow is rich. So then tomorrow promise will increase. We're going to go on this line up to this fixed point here, which is also equal to the omega star. But if tomorrow the old is poor, then we have to jump in this other plot. And if the old is poor, then it depends if the next period young is poor and old, whether we are going to, for example, reset to this point, or we are going to jump to the other plot. So from this plot, maybe is not so clear what is the dynamics of consumption, but what we can show is that, first of all, given this resetting condition is going to exist a stationary longer and invariant distribution, which is made by countably infinite state of promises. And these cycles, they're going to persist over time, also in the long run. I'll show you just a sequence of this consumption, just to fix ideas. So suppose what are these dots? So this is a time goes 1 to 20, for example, and remember that consumption at first best is 0.5. And suppose that anytime that there is a red dot, there is a young born who is poor. When it's blue, then it's rich. And the initial young is poor, then the planet will just deliver the welfare maximizing level and say that it's 0.5, is equalization consumption. But then the next period, young is rich. Is the one that has incentive to walk away. So I can't deliver 0.5 because there's not incentive to accept it. Then I have to deliver more to the young who is rich. Then in period 3, there is another young who is rich. So these two youngs are born in the same state, are both rich. But the consumption that the planet is delivering is different. Why? Because the second young who is rich is born after another young who was rich. And then to that young, the planet was promised a utility. This utility has to be delivered by the young who has to pay taxes in period 3. We're going to pay more taxes in order to keep the promises. And then if there is a young that now is poor, is born in state 4, and this young has to deliver on the past promises to the young that was, the previous young was rich. So the consumption has to be necessarily smaller than 0.5. So this is dramatically alter the consumption, so the consumption delivered to the poor. And we see that this, let's say, reduction in consumption for the poor is even more drastic depending on the length of young who are born in good states. So if you are born in a bad state after a very long sequence of young born in good states, then your drop in consumption will be quite dramatic. But it is not going to be a random walk. So these fluctuations are limited, are not unbounded, because at the most, if a young is born after infinite sequence, that at most the consumption that the planet is delivering is 0.5, is the first best. So that is providing a lower bound in the consumption fluctuation bottom, the lower side of consumption fluctuations. So this is an example of these consumption cycles that are generating just because of the limited enforcement frictions here. And we see that this dynamics is generated by the syncratic risk, which is actually temporary. So it's just affecting the current young, but it's persisting over time, even in the long run. And this is very important because now I can evaluate the stochastic discount factor in this model. So the stochastic discount factor is just the intertemporal marginality substitution of any generation born in some state. And if I consider the optimality condition that I showed you before, the first of the condition, and I replace into the definition stochastic discount factor, I find that the stochastic discount factor can be decomposed in 3 components. So one is the discount factor of the planet. The other is the growth rate of the economy, the inverse of the growth rate of the economy. And the other term is the ratio of consumption between adjacent generation of the young corrected by the multiplier associated with the participation constraint. Okay, let's suppose that there is full enforcement. So in the full enforcement case, we said that the consumptions are fully equalized, mu is equal to 0. So the stochastic discount factor is just delta multiplied by the inverse of the growth rate, as in a infinitely representative agent model. It's counter-cyclical. So larger is the growth and the lower is the stochastic discount factor. While in this model with limited enforcement friction, the stochastic discount factor is also affected by the idiosyncratic risk, because it is affecting the share of consumption. So then it will be, of course, counter-cyclical, as in the full enforcement case, but it's going to be increasing in the next period of idiosyncratic risk. So if the next period all are richer, so S is smaller, then the stochastic discount factor is going to be smaller. I value less to shift consumption between today and tomorrow if tomorrow I know that I'm rich. And this is generated this only in the limited enforcement case. It's very important because now it allows me to connect to this application, because I will use the stochastic discount factor to price bond when I introduce a state contingent bond. Okay, sorry. So what I do now? So I know what is the consumption allocation of all generations. Now I want to replicate this consumption allocation, assuming that the planet can use state contingent bonds. So I can issue bonds in contingent on the state of tomorrow, which is R. And then I can also raise taxes from the current young in order to repay the outstanding debt. So I denote capital D, the outstanding debt, T, the taxes, and this is the bond revenue. So the amount of bond multiplied by the state price. So in this model, the state price is given by the stochastic discount factor multiplied by the probability of realization of that state. So remember, in the stochastic discount factor, this is the consumption of the old next period, and this is the consumption of the young today. And basically, if I I exploit the homogeneity property of the utility function, I can define all variables as share of young endowment. It's going to be easier in terms of representation of policies. So we see from here that what I defined before, C, the consumption share of the young, is also equal to the endowment share of the young, they multiply 1 minus D, where D is the debt to be repaid in terms of endowment share of the young. So the debt to be repaid can be interpreted is also actually the transfer that the young are paid to the old. Okay?
Alessia,
So
we've got
yeah.
10 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay, so this is just my change of variables. So rather than using C, I want to use these policies, and now I want to characterize, I want to find what are the properties of this tax rate. Okay, so how the tax rate is changing when I change the level of debt that I have to repay. Of course, you should see from here a parallel between the debt to be repaid and the past promises. So there is actually a monotonic endowment-specific relationship between promises and debt, which actually comes just from the definition that omega was the promise utility to the old. So what I promised to the old, but the consumption of the young, I just showed that is equal to the endowment share multiplied 1 minus D. So D is related to omega and S. And then we characterize, so basically we can reframe all the problem rather than having omega as relevant state, having D, the outstanding debt, as a relevant state. And now what I want to choose is the amount of bond that I want to issue in each state of the world, which are these BR. So B is the amount of bond that I issue if the next period state is 1 or 2. Now, given that I have defined all variable as a share young endowment, the current D is also embedded in the current state. So I don't have, compared to before, I don't have to condition to the current idiosyncratic state because it's already embedded in the current D. So it's making the analysis a bit simpler, actually, at least graphically. So, but then the properties of the dynamics of debt looks very similar to the dynamics of promise utility. If the debt, first of all, we have extreme values of debt, which are endogenous. There is an upper limit of debt and the lower limit of debt. And then there is a critical level of debt below which the planner is going to issue bonds at the welfare maximizing level, as was omega. So this D naught is replacing omega naught, is the welfare maximizing level of debt. While above which the planner is issuing more bonds. It's exactly the same logic of promise utility. If the debt is larger, I have to promise more than the past promise. Okay, so given this debt dynamics, then we can characterize the bond revenue. So how much bond I can raise depends on the current level of debt. And this is the black line here. Basically, when the debt is lower than this critical level, I can't issue more bond revenue because of quantities, because quantities are fixed, are these debt that are fixed at the welfare maximizing level. But the price of bonds decline because we show the stochastic discount factor is actually, I haven't spent so much time, but the stochastic discount factor is decreasing with the past promises. So larger is the debt and less unwilling to pay in order to buy bonds because it's becoming more risky, basically. So when the debt is smaller than DC, the bond revenue decline because the price decline, but the quantity remains fixed. While when the debt is larger than DC, then I can issue also more bonds. I show here that I can increase the quantity of bonds that I can issue. So from one side, in this section, I have a lower price, but I can issue more bonds. So my bond revenue usually increase. So if I take the difference between the bond revenue and the outstanding debt, which is the 45-year line, I have that up to this point, the intersection point, I raise more revenue, bond revenue, than what I have to repay, which means that tau is negative. So there is deficit here. So I issue more, I have more bond revenue than what I have to repay. So I basically rebound the bond revenue that I have to the current young in terms of transfer. I can just subsidize consumption. When rather we are in this section, then the bond revenue is smaller than the debt that I have to repay. Then in order to repay this debt, I have to make the current young pay taxes. So then I will have a surplus here. So I can draw this tau, which I call fiscal, in literature is called fiscal reaction function, just taking the difference between these two lines. And the function is looking like this, is this solid line here, which is increasing with the debt. So I increase the taxes when the debt increase, but then above a critical level, the increase of taxes is not the same pace as the same pace as the increase of debt. I increase taxes at a lower rate. And the reason why I increase taxes at the lower rate is because I can issue more, I will issue more bonds actually, in order to provide incentive to pay those taxes. Because otherwise, if I ask taxpayer to pay taxes in a linear way rather than non-linearly, they will not pay the taxes because of limited enforcement friction. So this non-linearity is really generated by the limited enforcement friction. Okay, so basically I have now all the elements to show the last bit of the paper, which is how much debt I can sustain. So remember the intertemporal budget constraint. I can take the intertemporal budget constraint of before and iterate forward. And then the debt of today is actually equal to the net present value of primary surpluses of current taxes and future taxes, discounted at the stochastic discount factor. So the rate is endogenous and is equal to the stochastic discount factor. So this is the amount of debt that I can sustain. Now, this expectation can actually be decomposed into these two components. As long as the stochastic discount factor and the taxes are correlated, the expectation of the product is going to be equal to the product of the expectation plus the covariance. Okay? So if the covariance is equal to 0, suppose in the case in which I take exogenous interest rate, which is not correlated with the taxes, then the covariance is going to be 0. Then the amount of debt I can sustain is just the net present value of surplus is discounted the risk-free rate. But this is not the case because it's endogenous. Okay, so this covariance usually is going to be different from 0. Now, if it is positive, then I can sustain more debt, even more than just the sum of surpluses discounted at the risk-free rate. Remember, this expected of stochastic discount factor is equal to 1 over the risk-free rate. So if the covariance is positive, I can sustain more than just discounting the surpluses at the risk-free rate. If it is negative, I can sustain less. So what in this model? We show two things. We show that the surplus increase, so aprocyclical, of course. So I can raise more taxes when there is higher growth. The economy is growing, so I can, of course, have higher surpluses. So it's clearly procyclical. But I have higher surpluses, so I can raise more taxes also when the idiosyncratic shock increase. So why? Because if next period the young is richer, then I have to issue more bonds. And if I issue more bonds, then they can actually pay higher taxes. They will pay higher taxes. We saw that the tax rate, the fiscal reaction function is increasing in debt. So higher is S, richer are the young, and higher will be surpluses. So the young will pay the taxes in the state in which they can pay the taxes. While the stochastic discount factor, we saw that is, of course, countercyclical, as usual, but it is also increasing in S, as they are the surpluses. Why? Because remember, S increase means that the old tomorrow will be poorer, so they value more shifting consumption from today to tomorrow. So the stochastic discount factor is also increasing in S. So basically, this covariance can be decomposed in two components. One is related to the aggregate risk, and the other is related to the idiosyncratic risk. The one that is related to the aggregate risk is this first part, which, okay, let's look just a short step back. Suppose there is full enforcement. So in the full enforcement case, the stochastic discount factor does not depend on the idiosyncratic risk. So this component is going to be equal to 0, because it is the component of the covariance which is due to the variability of the idiosyncratic risk. The stochastic discount factor is just affected by aggregate risk in the full enforcement case, so there will be no this covariance term. While this other covariance term is going to be positive, is going to be negative, because this term here, due to convexity, is always negative. And this is a classical representative agent model in which the covariance between the stochastic discount factor and surplus is negative. So the amount of debt I can sustain is lowered by this negative covariance or positive beta of debt. While in the limited enforcement case, this second term is certainly positive, because we show that both surplus and stochastic discount factor co-move positively with the idiosyncratic risk. So this term is certainly positive. And this term actually could also be positive if we have deficit. And I show that for some level of current debt, I can actually have deficit. So in general, I can sustain a very high debt, even if I have just in expectation, I don't raise high surpluses because of this hedging value of the debt. The fact that the covariance is positive overall. And we can do a simple simulation. Suppose that I want to sustain today a level of debt.
Just be out of time. Be over time now. Yeah.
Okay, so can I have 1 second to conclude? Okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So just a simple exercise. I want to sustain today a level of debt of a GDP equal to 10% in the full enforcement case. And here I plot the expected surplus discounted the stochastic discount factor. And we show that these are always positive. It means that in order to sustain this level of debt, starting from tomorrow, in expectation, I have to raise surpluses. I have to pay taxes. While with the limited enforcement, look at the dotted line. These are the same, are the expected surpluses discounted at the stochastic discount factor. This could be always negative. And I can still sustain the 0.10% of GDP because the difference between these two is given by the covariance term. So the covariance term, which is positive, is pushing upward the value of debt that I can sustain. Okay? So this is the message of the paper, and I just conclude that so we developed this theory that also provided some implications in terms of sustainability of debt in a framework which is purely normative, and the future directions could be, of course, to make it richer, the demographic structure, and also add some more realistic assumptions, like moving from the pure endowment economy to an economy with storage technology, for example. Okay, thank you for the attention, and really happy to have more discussion afterwards.